The average 35-year-old American today has 30% less wealth than their parents had at the exact same age. That is not an opinion, and it is not a feeling, because it comes straight out of Federal Reserve research. But almost every family dinner in America still ends with the same confused argument between two generations who love each other. The parents insist they worked hard, saved carefully, and never wasted money. And honestly, most of them are telling the truth. The kids insist they are working just as hard, sometimes harder, and still cannot seem to get anywhere at all. Both sides are being honest, and yet both sides are missing the real story hiding underneath the entire disagreement. Therefore, the only fair way to settle this fight is to do something most families never actually do. Put the two generations side by side, at the same age, and compare the actual receipts line by line. The wages, the houses, the college bills, all in real numbers, until the answer becomes impossible to argue with. And at the very end of that ledger, one question remains, the most important question in the American economy today. If one generation lost all that ground, then somebody, somewhere, must have picked it up. This is the story of where the money actually went. Start with the paycheck, because that is where every family story begins. In 1968, the federal minimum wage in America was $1.60 an hour. That sounds like pocket change until it gets adjusted for inflation, and then the picture flips completely upside down. That 1968 minimum wage is worth roughly $14 to $15 an hour in today's money. Meanwhile, the actual federal minimum wage in America today is still sitting at $7.25. Therefore, the lowest paid worker in 1968 earned nearly double what the lowest paid worker legally earns right now. A teenager flipping burgers in 1968 had more real purchasing power than millions of adults working full-time today. But minimum wage is only the floor. So look at what happened to the typical American paycheck overall. Since the early 1970s, the real inflation-adjusted hourly wage for the average American worker has barely moved at all. 50 years of computers, smartphones, and stunning economic growth. And the typical paycheck stretched only slightly further than before. The economy itself more than doubled in size per person over that stretch, which makes the stagnation even stranger. The country got dramatically richer, but the typical worker's slice of that wealth essentially froze in place. Hold that thought, because it is the first clue about where the missing money eventually went. Now open the second page of the ledger, the one about college. In 1975, a student could attend a typical public university in America for a few $100s a year. Average tuition and fees at public four-year colleges sat around $600 annually in the late 70s. Do the math on that with the minimum wage of the era, and something almost unbelievable appears. A student earning minimum wage could cover a full year of public college tuition with one summer job. Roughly 200 to 300 hours of scooping ice cream or mowing lawns paid for an entire year of education. That is why so many boomer parents genuinely say they worked their way through school, because they actually did. But that door quietly closed on their children, and the numbers show exactly how hard it slammed. Today, average in-state tuition and fees at a public university run over $11,000 a year. At the current federal minimum wage, covering that bill requires more than 1,500 hours of work. That is not a summer job anymore. That is nearly a full-time job for an entire year, before rent or food. Therefore, working through college shifted from a normal path into a mathematical impossibility for most young Americans. So an entire generation did the only thing left available, and they borrowed the difference. Student loan debt in America has now swollen past $1.7 trillion across more than 40 million borrowers. The average borrower leaves campus owing close to $40,000 before earning a single professional paycheck. Their parents started adulthood at zero, but millions of their kids start adulthood $40,000 underwater. And that gap follows them into every decision, every apartment, every delayed wedding, and every postponed child. Because a monthly loan payment of $300 or $400 is money that never becomes savings, which leads directly to the third page of the ledger, the biggest number of all, the house. In 1970, the median American home cost around $23,000. The median household income that same year was just under $9,000. Therefore, a typical family could buy a typical house for roughly 2.5 times their annual income. A young couple in 1970 could realistically save a 20% down payment in about 2 years of disciplined effort. That house then became the engine of the entire middle class, quietly building equity with every single payment. But fast forward to today, and the same milestone has transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The median American home now costs well over $400,000. The median household income sits around $80,000, which sounds healthy until the division happens. That typical house now costs more than 5 times what the typical family earns in a year. The down payment alone often exceeds $80,000, which is an entire year of gross household income. Therefore, saving for it takes many families a decade or more, while rent devours the savings the whole time. Half of American renters now spend more than 30% of their income just keeping a roof overhead. The parents bought an asset that grew, but the kids rent a cost that only ever grows heavier. And here is the twist that makes this story genuinely uncomfortable at the dinner table. The parents' houses did not just shelter them. Those houses became the single greatest wealth machine in American history. The home a boomer bought for $60,000 in 1985 might be worth $600,000 today. That gain happened while they slept, while they vacationed, while they simply lived their ordinary lives. But every dollar that home price climbed was a dollar added to the wall their own children must now scale. Nobody planned that cruelty, yet the arithmetic delivers it anyway. One generation's windfall becoming the next generation's barrier. So stack the whole ledger up and look at it honestly. All 3 pages at once. Wages that froze for 50 years while the economy doubled. College costs that grew from a summer job into a lifetime of debt. Houses that jumped from 2 years of income to 5, with rent eating the escape route. Add healthcare on top, where family insurance premiums have roughly tripled just since the year 2000. Therefore, the conclusion is no longer a matter of opinion. And it is not about avocado toast or laziness. Americans under 40 make up 37% of all adults, but hold barely 7% of the nation's wealth. Meanwhile, baby boomers are about 20% of adults, yet control roughly half of all household wealth in the country. The average young family today runs faster than their parents ever did, on a track that got steeper every year. But now comes the question this entire video was built to answer. If workers produced all that extra value, and workers did not receive it, then who did? Because money does not evaporate, it only moves. And this money moves somewhere very specific. Follow the first trail, the gap between what workers produce and what workers get paid. Economists at the Rand Corporation actually calculated what stagnant wages cost ordinary Americans over the last several decades. Their findings should be carved into stone somewhere in Washington. If income growth had stayed as evenly shared as it was before 1975, the bottom 90% of Americans would have earned roughly $50 trillion more. $50 trillion, quietly redirected from the paychecks of the many into the accounts of the very few. That is not a rounding error. That is enough to pay every working American tens of thousands of dollars every single year. Therefore, the missing raise that families have been searching for did not disappear. It was captured. Follow the second trail, the one running straight through the corner office. In 1965, the typical CEO of a large American company earned about 20 times what their average worker earned. Today, that ratio has exploded to roughly 290 times the average worker's pay. The worker's productivity paid for that gap, but the worker never saw the check. Follow the third trail, the stock market, where the captured money finally came to rest. Corporate profits as a share of the American economy are hovering near record highs. Companies have spent trillions of dollars buying back their own shares, inflating stock prices for the people who own them. But here is the punchline about who actually owns those stocks. The wealthiest 10% of Americans own roughly 90% of all stocks held by households. Therefore, every dollar squeezed out of wages and pushed into share prices traveled up the wealth ladder, almost never down. And follow the last trail, the quiet one. The disappearance of the counterweight. In the 1950s, about 1 in 3 American workers belonged to a union that bargained for their share. Today, that number has collapsed to roughly 1 in 10 workers. The muscle that once forced the economy to share its growth simply withered away. So there is the answer, laid out plainly. with no villain wearing a black hat. The difference between the parents' America and the kids' America was captured by the owners of assets. Shareholders, executives, landlords, and anyone holding property while prices soared, that is where the generation's missing wealth lives. Some of those owners are the parents themselves, which is the most awkward truth in this entire story. The average boomer is not a mastermind. They simply bought in when buying in was still cheap. Their house appreciated, their retirement accounts compounded, and the system rewarded them for showing up early. Their kids showed up to the exact same system 30 years later and found every entrance ticket repriced. Therefore, this was never really a war between generations, no matter how it feels at Thanksgiving. It was a 50-year transfer from people who earn wages to people who own things. The parents happened to be standing on the ownership side when the transfer began. The kids were born onto the wage side, and they have been paying the toll ever since. But understanding this changes what the fight should actually be about. The question was never whether young Americans work hard enough, because the receipts prove they do. The question is why $50 trillion could leave the paychecks of 90% of the country without a national emergency being declared. The biggest heist in American history required no masks, no guns, and no getaway car. It only required everyone to keep arguing about avocado toast while the ledger quietly rewrote itself. So the next time someone says this generation just doesn't work as hard, hand them the receipts, because the average American under 40 isn't failing the American dream. The math of the American dream was changed, and nobody sent the memo.